Once you start to shoot video, particularly news, but really any video with an iPhone, as opposed to a DSLR, certainly a big shoulder-mounted camera, you enter a realm of the potential of creating a very different kind of a product. Not just easier to use, which it certainly is, and not just you have it in your pocket all the time, but actually the feel, the experience, and the experience for the viewer can be very, very different. But only if we use the iPhone properly. Most people who do this, particularly news organizations or broadcasters, well, they replace the big camera or, the hand or whatever they were using before, DSLRs, with an iPhone, and they continue to work in exactly the same way. And as a result, they miss the vast potential that the transition from big cameras or relatively big cameras to iPhones makes. And it's not so much the ease of use, which it certainly is, but it's really about the experience for the viewer. And that experience is manifest in a kind of intimacy that the use of the phone is able to establish with the subject that's being shot and with the material that's being shot, which a big camera simply can't do. So let me give you an analogy so you'll understand this. And the best way to understand this kind of transition and the implications of new technologies for media, visual media in particular, is to look at the history of still photography. In the early days of still photography, all photographers worked with these giant view cameras. They were so big, they sat on tripods. And when you shot with them, you shot on one piece of sheet film, or glass originally, and then sheet film. And because the camera was so big, and you've seen stuff like this, pictures like this all the time, the camera was placed on a tripod, and the subject sat very stiff and still in front of it. And you have probably pictures of your great-grandparents up in your attic somewhere that were done in a photo studio or something in this way. And the photographer went 3, 2, 1, and clicked the button, and everyone looks like this, right? Then in the 1930s, the Leica company invented, like this one, small handheld 35 millimeter cameras. And they shot originally, this one is digital, they shot 35 millimeter film, which meant that the images were only this big. The negatives were only that big. And professional photographers had a very difficult time adapting this because they were used to these big negatives, which certainly had good resolution. And they said, well, this is not real. Just like people who shoot big cameras on their shoulders look at iPhones and go, well, it's kind of a toy. It's not really. It's a very different experience, both for the subject and for the photographer, and particularly for the people who look at the product. So when we moved from big still cameras to little 35 millimeter Leicas like this and little portable film, the people who really understood it were able to invent a new kind of photojournalism. And so photographs went from being these very stiff, formal things to this kind of great intimacy. And if you look at some of the work of people like W. Gene Smith, who's one of my favorite photographers, or Cartier-Bresson, or anyone who began to use these things, you see the pictures are much more powerful, the images are much more intimate, and they communicate in a way that those big cameras couldn't, because with the little Leicas, they could get in really tight and close, to the subject like this, which you couldn't, and handheld, which you couldn't do with a big camera on a tripod. When television was first invented, the cameras were enormous because they had to be, because that was the technology. And as a result, they sat on a tripod, just like those giant view cameras. And if you look at our reporter stand-ups or our anchors, in news, they look like your great-grandparents and are very stiff and formal and like this. When we move from big cameras to small handheld phones like this, it's the same. We can do the same thing for cinematography and for video and for news that Leicas did for photojournalism, 70 years ago. That is, we can create a kind of because of what the tool allows us to do if we use it properly. So no tripods, no brackets, none of this crap that people put on it. Just like this, just really intimate and soft and communicating a sense of intimacy with the subject, and in that way the subject becomes more intimate with the photographer to begin with, and then the material that's created creates a kind of an intimacy and a personal relationship that you just can't get with a big camera. It's just a function of the technology. In 1961, the Museum of Modern Art in New York created an exhibition called The Family of Man, in which they put up 150 or so photojournalism works done with Leicas, with little tiny cameras. And that exhibition by the museum was the marker that we had taken photojournalism from a representative, craft. Here's a picture of a building, here's a picture of a person, here's a picture of a war scene. And it had been elevated to an art form. And that's why some of the great photojournalist works, I collect Salgados myself, can be very, very expensive, but they are not only journalism, they are art. And that was an enormous transformation, and they are powerful. They are powerful images in their own right. And so what the Leica did for photography and photojournalism in the 1940s and 1950s, phones can do now for television and video journalism, but only if we use them in a very, very different way.